Hi, welcome to a lecture on meninges, sinuses, and dural infoldings. It's an aspect of neuroanatomy. I'm Dr. Aidoo with the Department of Anatomy and Cell Biology. Let's go through this. What are dural infoldings? So these are the layers of the dura mater that folds on itself to partition the lobes of the brain. There are three main meninges. From superficial to deep, you have the dural mater, arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. The dural mater is the most dense and most protective. It has two main parts, the meningeal layer and then the endosteal layer. Now, these infoldings help partition the lobes and then restrict displacement due to accelerations and deceleration. So it means that it keeps the lobes in place, okay? And you will bear with me that a similar thing happens in the viscera, where you have mesenteries holding most of the organs which are suspended in the abdomen. If you look at the boxes and the way they hit each other on the head, this dural function helps a lot in such situations, else the lobes of the brains will just be moving at the direction of each blow. So this is a typical example of how these dural infoldings help. Sometimes the endosteal layer separates from the meningeal layer and forms a sinus, which allows blood to collect and flow. We'll look at all these as the dura mater forms the falx cerebri, which divides the two cerebral hemispheres into a left and right hemisphere. So those two hemispheres have in between them the falx cerebri. You have two margins of the falx cerebri, a superior one and then an inferior one, and these two edges will contain the superior sagittal sinus and then the inferior sagittal sinus. The falx cerebri courses all the way to the frontal bone, where it makes an impression in the frontal bone, a groove known as the groove for the superior sagittal sinus. If you study the bone, you see that groove impression created there. Then it also moves downwards and then attaches to the crystal galley of the ethmoid bone. Posteriorly, it connects to the occipital bone and also makes an impression known as the groove for the superior sagittal sinus around the occipital protuberance area. Then also you have this other dura mater that forms something like a tent. So it is called tentorium cerebelli. It forms a tent to cover the two cerebellar hemispheres. Now, the tentorium cerebelli is of clinical significance because of the fact that it can cause whiplash. Whiplash is a term that is used to describe the sudden cut of the brainstem by the sharp edges of the tentorium cerebelli in a road traffic accident when occupants are not in their seat belts. That sudden forward movement and backwards movement is able to cause this whiplash to occur. So it is advised to wear your seat belt anytime you are in any motor car. Then also deep to the occipital region, that is inferior to the falx cerebri, you find the falx cerebelli, which divides the cerebellum into two lobes. Okay, so just as the falx cerebri separates the two cerebral hemispheres, the falx cerebelli separates the two cerebellar hemispheres. So these are the major dural infoldings and partitioning that occur within the brain. Whenever the endothelial and meningeal layers separate, as I said earlier, they form sinuses. This is one typical example, the dural venous sinus. So it is also known as the sagittal sinus. The sagittal sinus can be superior or inferior, so they move along the margin of the falx cerebri. So there's one down here, which is the inferior sagittal sinus, and there is the superior sagittal sinus. You also have the straight sinus, and at its anterior end you have the great cerebral vein. Then you have this type of sinus that courses from the medial portion to the lateral portion of the occipital lobe all the way to the lateral portion of the parietal lobe. So that is known as the transverse sinus. There are two of them. So the one that courses on the right is known as the right transverse sinus, and the other one on the left is the left transverse sinus. Then there is a sigmoid sinus because it courses like an S shape. So that's the sigmoid sinus. And you can see that the sigmoid sinus is also located at the other half. We also have the superior petrosal sinus because it is within the petrous part of the temporal bone. Then you have the basilar sinus, sphenoparietal sinus, and then the intercavernous sinus within the sphenoid bone. Now when you look at the sagittal section through this head, you can appreciate the position of the superior sagittal sinus. Here you find the confluence of sinus where all the sinuses meet. Okay, and it's the point of association or meeting of all the other sinuses. You also have ventricles, which are cavities within the brain within which cerebrospinal fluid CSF are formed and stored. When you look at this diagram, you have two of them known as the two lateral ventricles, and that is the third ventricle and then the fourth ventricle. The two lateral ventricles are joined to the third ventricle by the foramen of Monro, and then the third ventricle is joined to the fourth ventricle by the cerebral aqueduct. Whenever there is a tumor or a blockage which impedes the flow, the free flow of this CSF, you end up having hydrocephalus. Then you look at this region too, you can see that it is showing the position where the lateral ventricle is likely to be situated. And then you also have the region where the third ventricle is likely to be situated. Within them, you find blood vessels, specialized blood vessels known as choroid plexus. The choroid plexus, together with ependymal cells, help secrete CSF, okay, and they flow through the ventricles through the cisterns, and then they go through the subarachnoid space and follow that circuitry. Within the fourth ventricle are two apertures which allow the CSF to flow out into the subarachnoid space. You have the superior one and then an inferior one. The superior one is the foramen of Luschka, and the inferior one is the foramen of Magendie. So this help to maintain the pressure and free flow of CSF. Thank you very much, and we shall meet one more time.